you don't know how to get good. At least, probably not in the way that I'm thinking of it. So today we're going to reframe what it means to get good with my
Building Gaming's greatest guide to getting good.
But seriously, the things we're about to cover are basically a template you can use for any game or any skill. So let's get to it. First, we got to talk about the difference between explicit and implicit memory. Explicit memory is anything that you can actually think of. Like when you think about your last meal that consisted of nothing more than a pound of bacon, but with no regrets. Implicit memory is when you don't have to think about something, but there's still a trained behavior. This can also be known as classic conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning. This is something like salivating at the smell of sweet, sweet bacon. I didn't choose for that to happen, it's just a trained response from when my parents fed me bacon and I learned to associate that smell with an incoming injection of fatty, crispy goodness. So yeah, thanks Dad. So why do you need to know this? Well, you actually need both to acquire skills, at least in a way that's controlled. Skill learning is basically exactly as it sounds. It's the acquisition of a new skill. It's often thought of as turning explicit declarative knowledge and turning it into implicit procedural skill. Turning that, or what, into how. And don't worry, we'll cover the definitions in a sec. So explicit declarative knowledge is when you can understand and declare something. And in this case, we're talking specifically about declaring how to do something. So here's an example.
I declare that when you're near the zone, you should capture the zone.
It has to be something you can say to yourself. That is what makes it explicit declarative knowledge. It's something you can declare. The procedural skill, on the other hand, is actually doing it. Obviously, these are not the same. I can describe how to do something but still not be able to do it. I could theoretically know how to do a pirouette, but not have the dexterity or finesse to pull something like that off. You might know how to do a certain play or build in StarCraft, but not have the speed to do it. All this is to say, the quality or amount of explicit declarative knowledge is very different from your actual skill. Good players are not always good teachers because they might lack the ability to put their skill into words. And good teachers are not always good players or performers because they might lack the skills necessary. So that's the gist of it so far. You have explicit declarative knowledge and implicit procedural skill. The goal is to turn one into the other. But how do we actually do that? When it comes to learning a skill, there are 3 stages of progress: cognitive, association, and automated. The cognitive stage is all about learning explicit declarative knowledge about the subject, understanding what exactly you need to learn. In a game, it might be X does this action or Y does this, like your super or some kind of grenade. Or red on the radar in this spot means enemies are likely in this area and you should probably be looking in that direction. Again, this is really different from actually having that skill. So you can still learn from a teacher even if they can't do it themselves. They just need to be able to identify flaws in your explicit declarative process. Now, this is also a very demanding process. You can't think of more than one thing at a time, so you probably shouldn't. And you need to consistently and deliberately rehearse the verbal declarative knowledge. So say you want to work on always being next to cover in your gunfights. You want to walk into a game and continuously and deliberately think, okay, I got to lane next to cover, lane next to cover, lane next to cover. In that instance, the cognitive stage is just thinking of the explicit declarative knowledge in your mind. It's the lane next to cover phrase you were repeating. But I'll talk a little bit later about optimizing this. Also, I wouldn't worry about memorizing the terms. It's not really that important. So that was stage 1, the cognitive stage. Now let's go to the second, associative. The associative stage is tweaking your skill through feedback and results. It's making adjustments based on feedback you receive. Say you're trying to snipe and you're constantly overshooting. That means going past the target. Then you know to adjust and not go as far. In that case, the skill was swiping the reticle to the target and the feedback was missing or hitting that target. This process cannot be done if you have no results or feedback to adjust to. You can do tweaking during a match, but it's much more beneficial to do this when you're able to really give it the attention it deserves. This is why recording gameplay is very important. Watching what you do or don't do on your recorded gameplay allows you to catch more than you would have otherwise. And you can just adjust on your next round anyway. So that was the second stage, the associative stage. The third and last stage is the automated stage. This is when the skill becomes the implicit procedural skill we've been talking about, aka something you don't have to think about, like we mentioned earlier. And in fact, trying to declare your process might impede your progress. Essentially, it should require no thinking to perform the skill or action, and even trying to think about it, aka micromanaging, would just slow you down. Imagine having to say, okay, right click to aim, left click to shoot, every time you wanted to shoot someone. it would really just get in the way. Or imagine trying to play tennis, but saying your footwork out loud, left foot, right foot, left foot, right. It just doesn't make any sense. You do, however, get to this automated stage by using declarative knowledge in the early stages. And again, automated implicit knowledge is obviously not the same as explicit declarative knowledge of the skill. In fact, you might actually lose the memory of that knowledge, aka the phrase or advice that created the skill in the first place. And in turn, it could make you a bad teacher. Feedback is also internalized here. Skills at this stage no longer need to see if they are too far or too close. They can just feel it and adjust accordingly. So those are the 3 stages. Cognitive, which is knowing the explicit knowledge you need to learn. Associative, which is adjusting to feedback. And automated, implicit skill and adjustments. Now we obviously want to get to the last stage, but how does this process really happen? How do we get to that last stage? Well, we turn the procedural knowledge into these automated production rules. If this, then that procedures. And this will be automatic as well. When the if conditions are met, you will automatically fire the then procedure. That makes it implicit. The idea is that your ability to do something like walk is stored as a big set of automatic production rules, the automatic associations between conditions and actions. And these production rules are stored in a procedural memory system, which is totally separate from the explicit declarative memory system. We do this through compilation. The conversion process known as knowledge compilation is when you compile explicit declarative knowledge and turn it into implicit procedural knowledge. There are 2 major stages: proceduralization and composition. Proceduralization involves taking an individual piece of declarative knowledge and converting that information into a single production rule, an automatic if-then association between conditions and actions, like we've been talking about. We turn explicit declarative knowledge into a production rule, and we do this one at a time. The production rule, like we've been talking about, is just an automatic association between sets of conditions and actions. Here's an example. If you're standing by an uncapped zone, then you capture the zone. The if this condition is having a zone near you that isn't captured, and the then this action is capturing the zone. So that's proceduralization, the act of creating an if this, then this procedure using declarative knowledge as the guide. The second stage is called compositional. This is where we turn a group of those procedural rules into one larger pattern. It's like how you try to tie your shoelace in one procedure now. Tying your shoes has many production rules that you probably don't think about, but at one point you did. For instance, number 1, create the overhand knot, then finish the basic shoe knot, then create the double knot, etc. Those are just a bunch of if this, then this procedures. But now you don't even think about any of that. You just do it. It's now compiled as an automated pattern. A pattern that at some point in your life you had to compile yourself by turning those singular production rules into a pattern. Playing a game has a lot of compositional elements as well. Like you've probably noticed in every good tutorial ever, they show you how to do things one step at a time. They show you how movement works. So they set the first procedure with the condition of I want to go somewhere. Now the action of pressing W, or whichever key it is now the action. So now that's your first layer of the procedure. Then they move on to jumping. Now you have 2 production rules. But then they want you to combine those. Now it's a combined pattern. So the next time you need to run and jump over something, you have a pattern of procedures to do that. There's a reason tutorials do this. It works. So hopefully now you have an idea of how this all breaks down and works. So let's see how well you remember the 3 stages of knowledge and skill acquisition. What were they? And then, what were the 2 stages of creating the larger patterns? Now, most people would be willing to just give you the answers right away, but testing is actually one of the best ways to remember something. So hopefully you do remember. If not, feel free to go back and check. All right, now that you have all that in your head, let's give you some tips to optimize this process. Number 1, know what you want to learn. Know the if this, then this you are trying to learn. Before you set off practicing something deliberately, you need to know what to practice. Otherwise, you won't make any meaningful progress. So know what will give you the most bang for your buck. Oftentimes, just covering the basics will be extremely helpful, especially in the early stages. Number 2, deliberately practice and focus on the piece of declarative knowledge. Say it in your mind over and over again. I cannot stress this enough. Do it for like an entire match, maybe even 2. Number 3, reflect on what you just did. How was it? How focused were you? Did you actually work on what you wanted to work on, or were you just playing? I would go back and do steps 1 through 3 again, just to make sure it's right. Number 4, choose the second skill you want or the next skill that you want. and then go through those steps again. Remember, we're trying to layer, so knowing what you need to know next is a big part of learning a pattern. Number 5, vary your practice. A lot of people assume you're better off practicing a single skill all day for several days. While this does help in the short term, in the long run, it's actually much slower. So you should only be spending 1 or 2 games or matches on a single skill you're trying to practice. Then I would swap to a different skill to work on. Number 6, space out your practice. Practicing for a whole day only once a week is not nearly as good as practicing an hour every day or even every other day. So make sure you're getting adequate practice over a longer period of time. This will also help out with the forgetting curve, which is to say that if you space out your reminders or repetitions, you will remember it for much longer. Number 7, deliberate practice and reflect. These are so important. If you're not listening to your own feedback, you are not making the right kind of practice. Because remember, once you get to the automated stage, you should be adjusting to feedback automatically. But if you don't train that way, you won't learn it that way. Number 8, understand what you're trying to compile. Know that learning the keys to shooting will then lead to memorizing arm movements for more precise aim, then lead to character movement for better strafing, then learning to be closer to cover, which then leads to knowing where good cover is, which means then learning the map, which then leads to learning how radar pings work, etc. Becoming a great player involves learning many procedures, but you only need to learn them one at a time. So take your time and learn them properly. Number 9, progress will slow down. That's totally normal. Early on, progress is really fast. And that makes sense. The amount you need to work on is quite large, so there's a lot of room for optimization. But don't fret once you acquire more skills and it seems like progress is super slow. That's normal. After all, the amount of room for improvement is much smaller now. So those are some tips that I think people should keep in mind when trying to learn a new skill. And I know that was super long and I'm kind of sorry about that, but I personally found it extremely helpful in my early days, and hopefully you'll find some helpful as well. In the next video, we're actually going to cover one of the pieces of declarative knowledge I think everyone should start with. And that also has the benefit of putting these tips to practice. And if you made it to the end, thank you so much for watching, and have a good day.